Most people dread returning home to an empty house. They fear the silence that greets them after a long trip. I, however, had spent the last 3 days at a high-level corporate conference in Brisbane, looking forward to nothing more than the comfort of my own home and the company of my wife, Fiona. I had finished my final presentation a full day ahead of schedule, thanks to a sudden change in the keynote speaker's itinerary. Impulsively, I decided to catch an earlier flight, eager to surprise Fiona. I didn't send a text or make a call. I simply wanted to see the genuine look of delight on her face when I walked through the door. I had even picked up some of her favorite gourmet treats from a deli in the city, intending to enjoy a quiet, laptop-free evening with my partner of 23 years. As I began my drive from the airport, a stray memory flickered in my mind, one I had dismissed at the time. Earlier that morning, before leaving for the conference, I had helped Fiona tidy the kitchen. I remember glancing into the waste bin and noticing a small, unconventional medicine bottle, a dark amber glass container with a faded, handwritten label that didn't match anything in Fiona's standard prescriptions. I had assumed it was something new she was trying for her joints, or perhaps something Chloe had brought over, and I had simply pushed the thought aside. It was a minor, inconsequential detail, yet as I turned onto our street, that small, dark bottle seemed to loom large in my subconscious, a phantom of unease. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows over the driveway, and I slowed my car to a crawl, my brow furrowing in confusion. There, parked squarely in the middle of our driveway, was a vehicle I recognized instantly, the Toyota Hilux belonging to my son, Lachlan. My pulse quickened. Lachlan and his wife, Chloe, lived in an apartment on the other side of the city, a residence I had helped them secure just 2 years prior. Lachlan was not the type to drop in unannounced. He rarely visited without a formal invitation or a specific request. Seeing his car there on a Tuesday afternoon, when he should have been at his office, felt distinctly wrong. I sat in my vehicle for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, asking myself why my son would be at our home without prior notice. I had no logical answer. I grabbed my carry-on bag and stepped out onto the driveway. The silence that hung over the property was not the peaceful, suburban quiet I was accustomed to. It was thick, heavy, and oppressive. It felt as though the very air in the house was holding its breath. I pushed the front door open, my steps echoing softly against the foyer floor. I braced myself for the sound of a television or the murmur of conversation, but there was nothing. The house was unnaturally still, a hollow shell of the vibrant home I had left behind just days before. I realized then that my sixth sense, the one developed after decades of shared life with Fiona, was screaming that something was fundamentally and perhaps dangerously wrong. I moved through the hallway toward the living room, my heart hammering against my ribs. The air felt stagnant, as if the circulation of the house had been choked off. I turned the corner and stopped dead. Lachlan and his wife, Chloe, were sitting on the couch, positioned stiffly as if they were waiting for a curtain to rise. They weren't watching television, nor were they occupied with their phones. They were simply sitting in tandem, their expressions unervingly composed, the posture of two people who had already processed the inevitable and were merely waiting for the final act to play out. Lachlan looked up as I entered. I observed him with a scrutiny I had never applied to my own son before. He didn't jump, he didn't gasp, and he certainly didn't look relieved to see me. He offered nothing more than a slow, deliberate blink. His lack of reaction was, in its own way, louder than any scream. Chloe, meanwhile, managed a thin, fragile smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes and felt entirely out of place for an afternoon that clearly held some hidden weight. Lachlan, I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. What is happening? Where is your mother? Lachlan cleared his throat, his movements measured and overly calm. Dad, he said, his tone devoid of the urgency one would expect. We were actually just on the verge of calling you. Fiona had an episode this morning. It was quite sudden. He paused, his gaze never wavering. She is currently at the Royal Brisbane Hospital. She is stable, so there was no reason to panic. I felt the blood drain from my face. My mind, usually sharp and analytical, suddenly felt like it was drifting in a fog. The Royal Brisbane? I repeated, the name of the hospital echoing with a terrifying finality. Lachlan nodded, offering a dismissive gesture with his hand, as if he were discussing a minor inconvenience rather than his own mother's health. Yes, she's receiving care. We thought it best to handle the admission ourselves. I didn't wait for further explanations. The calculated way they sat, the strange absence of distress, and the odd, rehearsed tone of his voice struck me with a cold, visceral clarity. I didn't say another word to them. I turned on my heel and left the house, not even bothering to close the front door behind me. I knew, with the chilling certainty of a man who has just been handed a death sentence, that everything I had ever known about my family had just been irrevocably fractured. I was back in my car in seconds, my thoughts already racing toward the only place that mattered. Fiona was in the hospital, and I was on my way to find out why. The drive to the Royal Brisbane Hospital was a blur of frantic speed and suffocating dread. I navigated the city streets with a tunnel vision that ignored every traffic rule, driven by the single, relentless goal of reaching Fiona. Upon arriving at the ward, my nerves were frayed, but the moment I reached the nurse's station, I forced myself to adopt a veneer of composure. I identified myself, and within moments, I was met by Dr. Eris, a physician whose presence commanded immediate respect. She was a woman of middle age with steady, piercing eyes and a professional demeanor that suggested she was accustomed to delivering truths that most people were not prepared to hear. "Mr. Sterling," she said, gesturing toward a quiet corner of the ward, away from the hum of activity. "I'm glad you arrived quickly. Your wife was admitted this morning after being brought in by your son. She presented with severe disorientation, significant organ stress, and alarming toxicity markers in her initial blood work." The word toxicity hit me like a physical blow. I leaned against the counter for support, my hands gripping the cold laminate surface. "Toxicity? Could you explain, doctor? Is this a result of an acute infection or perhaps a severe reaction to something she consumed?" Dr. Eris held my gaze, her expression unyielding. "We are currently running a comprehensive panel, but I must be entirely straightforward with you. The clinical pattern we are observing is not consistent with a sudden, isolated illness or a typical reaction. The markers suggest something systemic, something that has been accumulating in her system for a period of time. This has been building, Mr. Sterling. It is a process of gradual, deliberate exposure." The word deliberate hung in the sterile air between us, vibrating with a horrifying weight. I felt my breath hitch. I looked toward the room where Fiona lay, and the sight that greeted me was more harrowing than any professional description could convey. My wife, a woman of vitality, intelligence, and relentless spirit, looked diminished. She appeared hollowed out, as though someone had been slowly dimming a light inside her. The machines beeped in a rhythmic, monotonous cadence, and the 4 lines snaked in her arm like cold, parasitic vines. She looked impossibly small in the large hospital bed. I pulled a chair to her bedside and took her hand. It felt cold, lacking the warmth I had known for over 2 decades. I didn't care about the clinical environment or the curious glances of the medical staff. I leaned down and whispered a promise into the quiet, sterile room. I promised her that I would not leave her side, and more importantly, that I would uncover exactly what had happened to her. As I sat there, the shock that had initially gripped me began to harden into a cold, focused resolve. The veil of uncertainty had been lifted, and in its place was a singular, terrifying certainty. Someone had been systematically destroying the woman I loved, and I was going to find out who. I retreated to the hospital waiting area, the harsh fluorescent lights casting long, jagged shadows across the linoleum. My mind was a chaotic storm of fragments. The unnatural composure of Lachlan and Chloe, the clinical precision of the doctor's findings, and the haunting sight of Fiona fading away. For the first time in my life, I felt the seductive pull of denial. It was a comfortable, muffled place where I could pretend that this was all a tragic misunderstanding, that perhaps it was a faulty supplement or an accidental poisoning. But as I sat there, the weight of the situation anchoring me to the plastic chair, I realized that denial was a luxury I could no longer afford. It was a fragile shield that would only leave me vulnerable. I took a deep breath, figuratively evicted that comforting lie from my mind, and reached for my phone. I dialed David, or Davo, as I call him since our university days. He had been my closest confidant for nearly 40 years, a man who had seen me through every professional and personal crisis without ever needing to sugarcoat the truth. He picked up on the second ring, his voice calm and grounded. "Bruce, what's going on? You sound like you've been through the ringer." "Fiona is in the ICU, David," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The doctors are calling it toxicity, something cumulative. They believe it's been building for months." There was a profound silence on the other end, the kind that speaks volumes. When David finally spoke, his voice was tight. "Who has been around her?" "Think, Bruce. Who has had access to her daily routine? Her food, her water, her medicine?" The question acted like a key turning in a lock. I closed my eyes, visualizing the past few months. For months ago, Fiona had suffered a minor injury, a ligament strain after a slip on the stairs. It had been nothing severe, but it was enough to make her vulnerable. Lachlan had been quick to offer a solution, suggesting that Chloe, who had a flexible schedule and worked only part-time, could stop by the house every morning to assist Fiona with her breakfast and ensure she stayed on top of her daily vitamin regimen. At the time, it had seemed like a gesture of genuine concern, a rare moment of familial kindness that had made me think perhaps I had misjudged my son's maturity. "Chloe," I said, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. "She's been coming over every morning for months to help Fiona with her vitamins and her morning routine." David's exhale was sharp. "Bruce, if this is systematic, it isn't an accident. It's a design." The realization hit me with the force of a physical impact. I remembered the way Chloe had smiled at me in the living room, and the way Lachlan had barely blinked when I returned early. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were beginning to assemble into a picture so grotesque I could hardly bear to look at it. My own son and daughter-in-law were not just suspects. They were the architects of my wife's slow disappearance. I realized then that my war wasn't against an illness, but against the people I had helped build. And as the clock ticked toward midnight, I knew I would need to move with the precision and focus of someone who had nothing left to lose. The hospital waiting room was deserted, save for the rhythmic humming of the vending machines and the occasional chime of an elevator. I sat in the corner, illuminated by the cold, blue light of my tablet. My hands, which had trembled earlier, were now remarkably steady. I had always approached my career in finance with a methodical, cautious mindset, and I realized that these same skills were now the only tools I had to survive the most harrowing investigation of my life. I logged into our joint household account, the one Fiona and I had maintained for years, and began to methodically review the transaction from the last 6 months. At first glance, the account appeared normal, reflecting our standard utilities, grocery expenses, and maintenance costs. But as I narrowed my focus and began to cross-reference dates, a chilling pattern emerged. There were consistent, small withdrawals that, when viewed in isolation, seemed entirely mundane. $200 here, $350 there. They were the kind of transactions that easily blended into the background of a busy household budget, rarely triggering a second look. Yet as I systematically calculated the cumulative total, my breath hitched. Over the past 5 months, nearly $11,000 had been siphoned away in these microscopic increments. The strategy was undeniably intentional. It was the work of someone who knew exactly how to stay beneath the radar of our standard monitoring. It wasn't an act of impulse or a sudden financial emergency. It was a calculated, patient drain of assets. I felt a surge of cold fury, but I forced myself to suppress it, channeling that emotion into a rigid, analytical focus. I took screenshots of every single line item, organizing them into a digital folder with a precision that bordered on obsession. I checked the time, 2 a.m. I didn't hesitate to call David. He answered instantly, his voice alert, as if he'd been sitting by the phone waiting for me to reach out. "Talk to me, Bruce," he said, skipping the pleasantries. $11,000, I stated flatly, my voice echoing slightly in the empty corridor. Gone from the joint account over the last 5 months. It's systematic, David. Someone was stealing from us, slowly and consistently. That is not the behavior of a desperate person, David replied, his tone grave. That is the behavior of someone who has carefully calculated their moves. They weren't just taking money, Bruce. They were testing the boundaries of what they could take without notice. They were measuring your awareness. My son, I whispered, the words feeling heavy and foreign on my tongue. My own son sat down and planned this. Every single withdrawal was a deliberate strike against us. We don't have enough to present to the police yet, David warned, his voice softening with empathy. But we have a trail, and a trail, no matter how small, is a beginning. I ended the call, staring at the screen. The numbers on the display were no longer just digits. They were proof of a betrayal so profound that it rendered the silence of the hospital even more deafening. The financial evidence was the missing piece that moved this from a medical tragedy into a criminal conspiracy. And as I looked up at the window, watching the faint gray light of dawn begin to touch the horizon, I knew that the foundation of their plan was already beginning to crumble beneath the weight of the truth. I stood up from the plastic chair, my movements stiff from hours of immobility, and walked toward the hospital entrance. I knew I needed to maintain an iron grip on my composure. If I were to confront them, it would not be with the outbursts of a grieving father, but with the measured precision of a man who had already seen the cracks in their foundation. Lachlan and Chloe were still in the waiting area, looking like two actors who had lost their stage direction. As I approached, Lachlan stood up, his face adopting that practiced, concerned mask he had worn since my arrival. "Dad, listen, we've been waiting for you," he started, his voice hitting a conciliatory note. "We know how this looks, but you're under a lot of stress. Let's sit down and talk about everything logically." I held up a single hand, stopping him mid-sentence. My gaze was fixed, not on his face, but on the space just behind him, projecting a detachment that seemed to unsettle him more than any verbal attack would have. Beneath my calm exterior, however, a visceral agony was tearing at my chest. Every fiber of my being was screaming in protest. I was looking at the man I had raised, the boy I had coached on the footy field and supported through every heartbreak, and realizing that the person standing before me was a stranger born of greed. The betrayal didn't just hurt. It felt as though my very identity was being dismantled from the inside out, replaced by a cold, hollow void where my pride as a father used to reside. I had to bury that agony deep, locking it away behind a wall of steel, because if I allowed myself to feel the weight of this heartbreak, I knew I would never be able to stand again. "There is nothing for us to discuss," I said, my voice quiet, devoid of tremor. "I have seen enough to understand the nature of the situation. You both need to leave the hospital premises immediately. You are no longer welcome near your mother, and you are no longer welcome in our home." Lachlan blinked, a flicker of genuine shock crossing his features. "What? Dad, you can't be serious." "Mom is in there. I am very serious," I interrupted, my tone icy. "Go home." I turned my back on them and walked to the nearest quiet corner, pulling out my phone. With the methodical focus of an expert, I began to dismantle their access to our world. One by one, I logged into our private banking portals and implemented a total lockdown. I revoked Lachlan's secondary access to our accounts, deactivated every authorized credit card, and modified the security protocols on our primary estate holdings. I watched as the notification symbols began to ping on their phones, sensing their panic before it even manifested. I looked up just in time to see the color drain from Chloe's face as she stared at her device, her eyes wide with a sudden, sharp realization. The facade of innocence began to evaporate, replaced by a frantic, jagged edge of panic. They had built their plan on the assumption of my ignorance, operating under the belief that I was a distracted man who would never look beneath the surface. They had miscalculated. Lachlan took a step toward me, his composure finally fraying at the edges. "Dad, don't do this." "You have no idea. I have exactly the amount of information I need," I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous, low register. The time for explanations has passed. Every minute you stay here, the risk to your future grows. I suggest you take this opportunity to leave before I decide to involve the authorities immediately." They stared at me, a mix of confusion, anger, and mounting terror. They didn't know the extent of what I had uncovered, and that uncertainty was my most powerful weapon. As they turned and hurried toward the exit, the sound of their retreating footsteps echoing through the sterile hallway, I finally felt the first tremor of genuine emotion. I wasn't just a father protecting his wife. I was a man who had just severed the final tether to the people who had tried to destroy us. The confrontation was over, but the war had only just begun. The following morning felt like a lifetime had passed. I remained at the hospital, perched in the waiting room with a cup of lukewarm, bitter coffee, when Dr. Eris finally emerged from the lab. She did not wear the standard mask of professional distance. Instead, her expression was somber and focused. She motioned for me to join her in a private consultation room, a space where the atmosphere was heavy with the gravity of clinical facts. "Mr. Sterling," she began, sliding a thick file across the desk. "The comprehensive toxicology panel has returned. The results are definitive. We have identified elevated levels of a specific heavy metal compound in Fiona's blood and tissue samples. This is not an acute, one-time exposure. The concentration profile confirms a chronic, long-term ingestion, consistent with regular, controlled doses administered over several months." I felt my heart sink. Even though I had braced myself for this, hearing the clinical confirmation was a devastating blow. "Can you tell me how this is introduced?" I asked, my voice strained. "Is it something airborne? Something in the water supply?" Dr. Eris shook her head slowly. "The nature of this compound makes it ideal for sabotage. It is essentially tasteless and odorless, and it dissolves perfectly into liquids or powders. It is the kind of agent that can be easily masked in vitamin supplements or morning beverages. In small, calculated quantities, it would not trigger an immediate reaction, but over time, it compromises the kidneys and the nervous system. Fiona is exceptionally resilient, which is why she is still with us, but the damage is significant." I gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white. My thoughts flashed back to Chloe, her morning visits, and her insistence on ensuring Fiona took her daily supplements. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. I immediately pulled out my phone and contacted Margaret Holloway, a sharp-tongued, no-nonsense senior litigator in Brisbane whom I had known for years. Margaret was a woman who lived for the rigor of the law and took a personal interest in seeing justice served. "Margaret," I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the room, "I have the medical confirmation. It's deliberate poisoning, systematic and calculated." "Stay exactly where you are, Bruce," Margaret replied, her voice immediate and razor-sharp. "Do not touch anything in your house. Do not confront them again, and above all, do not post a single word about this on social media. I'm gathering my team. We're going to build a case that is airtight, no cracks, no exits, and no way for them to argue their way out of this. I want them to feel the full weight of the law, Margaret," I said, my voice hardening. "I want them to understand the scale of what they have destroyed." "Leave it to me," she promised. "By the time we are done, they will realize that they have picked the wrong family to betray." I hung up, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction. The medical mystery was solved, and the tactical phase had begun. I returned to Fiona's side, feeling a new sense of purpose. I held her hand, watching the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. She was still fighting, and now, for the first time, I had the weapon I needed to fight back. The evidence was being compiled, the legal net was being cast, and for the first time in this nightmare, the trajectory of the outcome had shifted in our favor. The following morning, at exactly 7:14 a.m., my phone chimed with a message from David. It was brief and urgent. "I have the answers you need. Meet me at the office." I left Fiona in the care of the hospital staff, having been assured she was stable, and drove to David's office in the city. The air was crisp, but I felt a cold, deep-seated numbness as I walked through the doors. David was waiting for me, his desk covered in stacks of legal documents and insurance correspondence. "Bruce, sit down," he said, his voice unusually somber. You were right. This wasn't just about the $11,000. That was just the incidental spending money for their day-to-day. The real target was far, far larger. He slid a document across the mahogany desk, a copy of Fiona's life insurance policy and estate amendment. 6 weeks before Fiona ended up in the ICU, she visited an estate attorney in the city. She wanted to finalize a surprise for her anniversary. She was moving to redirect her entire primary insurance policy and a significant portion of the estate, valued at $4.5 million, away from the family trust. She was creating a charitable foundation for literacy programs in the Outback, a project she had been quietly developing for 2 years. I stared at the paperwork, the figures blurring. She never mentioned a word of this to me. She wanted to present it as a fully funded, functioning foundation as a gift to the community. Lachlan found out, David continued, his face grim. I don't know how, but he discovered that he was being cut out of the $4.5 million policy. The estate attorney had a mandatory 30-day processing window for the changes to become legally binding. Fiona collapsed with only 30 days left on that window. They knew that if she lived to see the end of that month, the money would be gone forever. They didn't just want to steal from you, Bruce. They were trying to beat the clock to ensure they stayed the primary beneficiaries. The weight of it settled in my chest like lead. My own son, the boy I had raised and provided for, had sat down and weighed my wife's life against a balance sheet. He and Chloe had decided that $4.5 million was a fair price for a human life. It wasn't an act of passion or a moment of weakness. It was an act of cold-blooded, calculated greed. They weren't just poisoning her, David, I said, my voice barely audible. They were waiting for her to die so they could finalize the inheritance before the legal window closed. They were playing a game of chess, Bruce, David replied. But they failed to realize that you were the one holding the board. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The fear that had been gnawing at me for days vanished, replaced by an absolute, frigid focus. I stood up, feeling as though I had finally peered into the heart of the darkness, and I was no longer afraid of it. I had the motive, I had the financial trail, and I had the medical proof. The net was closing in, and for the first time, I felt the grim satisfaction of knowing exactly where this would end. I walked out of the office, the city noise muffled by the intensity of my resolve. I had a clear path forward, and I knew exactly what had to be done to ensure that the people who had tried to silence my wife would face the full consequences of their actions. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in controlled, strategic silence. Margaret Holloway worked with the precision of a surgeon, coordinating with the authorities to ensure every piece of evidence was meticulously cataloged. David, meanwhile, had managed to secure something that would prove to be the final nail in their coffin: surveillance footage from a boutique pharmacy 2 towns over. The video showed Lachlan purchasing the exact brand of supplement that had been linked to the toxicity, paying in cash, always alone, and always looking over his shoulder. On one occasion, the exterior camera had captured Chloe waiting in the car, her face clearly visible as she checked her watch, waiting for her partner in crime to return with their lethal supplies. Margaret also secured the digital trail of the withdrawals, cross-referencing them with the timestamps of the insurance inquiries. In a final, breathtaking act of arrogance, Lachlan had actually called the estate attorney's office, posing as Fiona's personal assistant to inquire about the status of the policy changes. He had left his own mobile number for a callback, a blunder so significant it defied logic. When David showed me the transcript of that call, I simply stared at the wall, struggling to comprehend how my son could be simultaneously so calculated in his malice and so remarkably incompetent in his execution. On the 5th day of Fiona's recovery, Lachlan and Chloe arrived at the hospital together. They were carrying an expensive bouquet of flowers, wearing the practiced, somber expressions of people who had decided that a charm offensive was their only remaining strategy. I saw them from the hallway as they approached. Lachlan caught my eye and immediately deployed a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a hollow, brittle expression that looked as if it were cracking under the pressure. "Dad," Lachlan said, stepping into my path. "We've been so worried. How is she?" We need to talk about everything. I looked at him, then at Chloe, and then back at the end of the corridor where I knew the officers were waiting. I spoke with a calm, conversational tone, as if we were discussing the weather. She is awake, Lachlan. She is talking, and she's going to make a full recovery. However, the police are currently waiting for you in the lobby. Margaret Holloway has filed everything. The pharmacy records, the bank logs, the transcripts of your calls, and the toxicology report. It is all in a very neat, very damning package. The effect was instantaneous. The color drained from Lachlan's face, leaving him a ghastly, pale gray. Chloe let out a sharp, ragged sound, her composure shattering instantly. Lachlan started to stammer, but I held up a hand. There is nothing you can say that will change the trajectory of this afternoon. The flowers are a nice gesture, but they are entirely irrelevant now. As the officers moved in, I turned my back on the scene. I watched from the window as they were escorted out to the parking lot, the very flowers they had brought for their display of affection still clutched in their hands, evidence to be bagged and tagged. The trap had been set with surgical precision, and now the doors were slamming shut on the life they had tried to steal from us. 3 months after the nightmare began, Fiona finally came home. The morning was quintessentially Brisbane, golden light filtering through the eucalyptus trees, casting long, peaceful shadows across our veranda. She walked through the front door, pausing in the hallway as if she were re-cataloging every detail of a life she had so nearly lost. Then she turned to me with a faint, wry smile and said, "Bruce, the kitchen really needs repainting. This shade of cream is quite dated." I laughed, the sound feeling fresh and honest for the first time in an age. It was the familiar, sharp-witted Fiona I had missed so dearly, and hearing her critique the house felt like the final, definitive signal that the worst was behind us. The legal process that followed was swift and merciless. Lachlan and Chloe faced charges of attempted murder, criminal conspiracy, and systemic financial fraud. Margaret Holloway prosecuted with the cold, unyielding precision of a veteran litigator who had spent 30 years waiting for a case that was this absolute. The trial lasted only 11 days, as the evidence, the pharmacy receipts, the bank trails, and the damning audio of the estate inquiry made a defense nearly impossible. The jury reached a verdict in less than 4 hours. The sentencing was significant, reflecting the gravity of their calculated cruelty. I will not dwell on the numbers, as no duration of incarceration could truly measure the cost of what they attempted to destroy, but the outcome was final. When the verdict was read, I sat beside Fiona in the courtroom. She held my hand with a grip that felt like steel, her eyes fixed forward with unwavering resolve. When the proceedings concluded, she leaned toward me and whispered, "I think we should go to that Thai place in New Farm tonight." I smiled, surprised. "Tonight?" She nodded, her eyes bright with a renewed sense of purpose. "I have been thinking about their pad thai for 3 months, Bruce. Do not test me on this." We went, and it was a celebration of survival. David, Margaret, and even Dr. Eris, who had become a close friend after guiding us through the medical crisis, joined us. We sat around the table, laughing and talking, and I found myself simply watching Fiona. She was gesturing wildly, telling a story with the same vibrant, formidable energy I had fallen in love with 23 years ago. I had said at the beginning of this ordeal that I wished I hadn't come home early, that I wished I hadn't seen the truth. I was wrong. I was profoundly grateful that I had walked through that door when I did. If I had arrived even a day later, the outcome would have been a tragedy written in stone. I had turned on the lights, and I had faced the darkness so that my wife could have a future. That was the job. That was always the job. And as we left the restaurant under the vast, clear Queensland sky, I knew that while the world had changed, we had survived, and for the first time in a long time, the path ahead was finally ours to walk.